Please welcome Dan Kahan.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Lauren. That was very kind introduction, and it's very exciting for me to be here, and I'm eager to talk with people and to listen to other presentations. I'm anticipating learning a lot, so I'll try to do my part and add something to the conversation here. Something that actually is a consequence not just of work that I do on my own, but work that really is part of a large research collaboration. And so even though they weren't introduced, their work is really as much as what I'm presenting is my own. And what I'm going to talk about is the science communication problem. And by that, I just mean to refer to the existence of intense and persistent public conflict over facts that seem to admit of scientific investigation, right, and maybe even scientific resolution, and that bear on the common welfare. Right? Now, climate change is maybe the most conspicuous example of that right now, but it's not the only example of this kind of problem. There's tremendous public conflict over, for example, whether schoolgirls should have the HPV vaccine. There's tremendous public dissensus about the safety of depositing nuclear waste in deep geologic isolation. These are things on which there seems to be the same kind of evidence and indicia of scientific consensus as there is on climate change, including National Academy of Science consensus reports, directives from the Center of Disease Control, and so forth. Yet we have tremendous controversy over these matters. Right? And I'm going to give you an account of at least part of the reason, I think a fairly large part, but a significant enough part to worry about, of the reason for this that grows out of the research that we do. It's research on the phenomenon of cultural cognition, and Lauren did a good job of giving you a sense of what that is. Basically, the tendency of people to conform their beliefs, maybe about societal risks or other kinds of policy consequential facts, to values that they share with other people. Right? And so our claim is that the cultural cognition dynamic is part of the science communication problem. Right? And it's important to recognize that it's part of the problem, because if you're going to solve the problem, you need to know what's causing it. And even more, I think, important than the insights that the work yields on why you see some of the divisions that you do, it generates certain kinds of prescriptions, certain kinds of proposals. They're very different from commonly identified ones for dealing with this science communication problem. Okay? So here's what I'm going to do, basically give you a little overview here. I'm going to start with just a very simple model of how people's values might influence their perceptions of risk and cause conflict. Then I'll present some evidence to suggest that that model actually is a good account of what's happening in the world and explaining the kind of conflict that we see over climate change and other issues. Then I'm going to talk about why scientific consensus doesn't necessarily dispel this kind of problem, this kind of dynamic. Right? And if there's time, we'll get to what's to be done about it. That might take too long, and that's boring. Here's the truth, though. I want to tell you in part about this research because I want you to help me to figure out what's to be done. Honestly, we have progressed further in our research in identifying what the actual source of the problem is than we have in identifying solutions. Although, as I said, I believe that understanding why you have the problem is a first necessary step to coming up with prescriptions. I can give you some of my own ideas and share some of our research with you. But I want to motivate you to also help with that, right? And to motivate you, I do have to convince you that this is a sensible way to think about the problem. So I hope you'll accept that I'll probably spend more time on that, but I'll be here all day too if I don't get to talk enough about solutions. All right, so first, start with a model, a simple model, in fact, a simplistic model of how people might form their beliefs about risks and other kinds of policy-relevant facts. Right? On this model, people are exposed to new information from science, and they update their existing beliefs about the problem and form ones that are more consistent with the new information. Right? It's a Bayesian process if you understand these kinds of things. And if that's how things worked, that would be really, really good because no matter how stupid people were at the start, as long as they kept being exposed to the new information and they kept updating their prior beliefs, eventually they would converge on the best available understanding of what they should do to make their lives better, right? There'd be a steady proliferation of knowledge. Now, things don't work that way, right? One of the reasons they don't work that way is there's a kind of interdependence between people's existing beliefs about these matters and the way that they engage information, including scientific information, right? People are much more likely to seek out information that's consistent with what they already believe than information that challenges and upsets what they already believe. In addition, they tend selectively to credit and discredit information in ways that reinforce rather than undermine what they already believe. And you see why this is a problem. People aren't updating their existing beliefs based on new information. They're using what they already believe to decide whether the new evidence is any good, right? So I say something like, hey, everybody from Sweden has blonde hair, you know, and you say, oh, wait, what about, you know, Arnie over here has black hair. I look at it, yeah, he has black hair. So he's not from Sweden, he's from Finland or something like this, right? My belief is normative for what evidence, and I'll never update my beliefs. And so, you know, it's confirmation bias is what many psychologists working on this research program, I learned things. That's what they call this. It's not good, but it's actually not as bad as what we actually have, right? So you add cultural predispositions to the model. And for now, just understand that as some kind of tendency people have to accept certain kinds of claims about risk and reject others in ways that reflect values they share with other people, right? Now, these cultural predispositions are the source of people's existing beliefs, but the cultural predispositions also have this kind of interaction with how people are engaging information. People are seeking out information that's more congenial to their cultural predispositions, or maybe just because they associate with other people like them, they're more likely to be exposed to information that's consistent rather than challenging to their cultural predispositions. Right? And when they're confronted with evidence, maybe by people who aren't part of their cultural group, they selectively credit it or discredit it, depending on whether it's consistent with the positions that are congenial to people who have values like them. Where you have a dynamic like that, you're going to have confirmation bias. Now, I'm just telling you why you have confirmation bias. The same influence that's responsible for people's existing beliefs is now controlling their exposure to and their processing of information, right? But you see, people's cultural predispositions vary, right? Different people believe different things, have different values. So people are going to start out with different understandings of how the world works that are based on their values, or cohere, or correlate with their values. Then they're going to engage in opposing forms of information search. They're going to selectively credit and discredit information in offsetting, opposing patterns that reinforce what their group believes, right, and not what the other group believes. So you have confirmation bias and you have division, right? It's not so smart and it's not very pleasant. It's persistent cultural polarization. That's the simple model. Not as simplistic as the simplistic model, but the simplistic model is completely false. This one I want to say, it has elements, enough elements of truth in it to be taken seriously by people who want to try to do something to improve the situation. Right? And so now to give you the evidence, right? Some evidence of how this happens. Right? Do you know what nanotechnology is? Yeah? That's because you're weird, right? Did you know you're weird? 80% of the people in the United States, they say they've either heard nothing or very little, maybe they're trying to make a joke, about nanotechnology, right? 90% of them say they have an opinion on whether it's good or bad, but most people have never heard of nanotechnology. So this would be an interesting thing to try to study, to see how people are going to react to new information. So my colleagues and I include Don Brayman, an anthropologist at George Washington University, Paul Slovic is a psychologist and does lots of work on risk at the University of Oregon, John Gastel in communication, other people, right? Many other people. It's not by any means me doing all of this stuff. It's mainly me learning all this stuff. We collect a large, diverse sample of ordinary Americans, right? And the first thing we do, we measure their values, right? Their worldviews, using a framework that is associated with the work of an anthropologist, a late anthropologist, Mary Douglas. And Mary Douglas characterized people's worldviews, just their preferences about how society, or maybe other kinds of collective undertakings they're involved in, should be organized, right? Along two dimensions, and they're pretty straightforward, right? Individualism and communitarianism. Do you think that individuals should secure the conditions of their own well-being without any assistance or interference from the collective? You're more individualistic. Do you think that the collective should take responsibility for providing for basic needs? And when individual strivings get in the way, have priority over them? You're more communitarian, right? Hierarchy and egalitarianism. Do you think that to make society or other kinds of institutions run, you need a lot of rankings based on fairly fixed, conspicuous roles, right? Or do you think who owes what to whom shouldn't depend on these kinds of conspicuous, fixed social statuses, right? If it's the former, you're hierarchical. If it's the latter, you're egalitarian. In a book that she wrote, it was very controversial, but very influential, with Aaron Wildavsky, who was a political scientist, Douglas said that we should expect people's perceptions of risk to reflect and reinforce combinations of the values that are characterized by this framework, right? So the more hierarchical and individualistic you are, Douglas and Wildavsky argue, the more likely you are to reject, to be skeptical about environmental risk claims. Why? Because you perceive, I guess unconsciously, she doesn't talk that much about mechanisms. That's one thing we're interested in. But in any case, there's a hostility between the acceptance of those environmental risk claims and forms of activity that are important within a hierarchical and individualistic way of life, like commerce and industry. If you're more egalitarian and communitarian, you already have a certain amount of moral ambivalence about commerce and industry, which you see as the source of many unjustifiable social disparities. So it's more congenial to you, Mary Douglas and Aaron Wildavsky say, to believe, find credit the claim that those activities are also dangerous and they're creating harm for people. And in research that we've done, other people have done too, it's essentially correlational in nature. We find that it is the case that people's values measured in this way explain or at least display, right, the relationship between their perceptions of environmental risks like climate change and nuclear power that you would expect if Douglas were right. We've looked at other things too, like gun risks. You know, for hierarchs, and individualists, guns are important. They enable certain kinds of roles that are hierarchical, like father and protector and provider. Right? See that this is very authentic. I'm all of those things, and I need a gun for those. Or individualistic virtues like courage and self-reliance and honor, right? And in particular white men who have those values, and therefore the claim that the guns are dangerous is particularly threatening to the ways of life that are important to them. They reject that. The guns aren't dangerous, right? We're more egalitarian, communitarian. You think that guns are kind of a gesture of kind of distrust, of others. They're associated with patriarchy, racism, enforcement of white supremacy. You don't like guns, and you're more likely than the theory would say to credit evidence that guns are dangerous, cause accidents, and that gun control works. Right? And we found evidence that supports that. Other things too, like whether abortion it has bad health consequences for women, whether it's effective or dangerous to have judges have the power to order people to have psychiatric treatment and medication, HPV vaccination. Right? Those are the values, right, that we were measuring and the kind of association they have with different kinds of risks. But one of the interesting things then about nanotechnology, it doesn't have a profile as large, as it were, in the public consciousness as things like climate change and gun control, which we already know they're culturally polarized. Right? People don't know anything about nanotechnology. So it's kind of interesting to see whether maybe these values are going to have some influence on how they form views about a new risk. And because they don't have views at the moment, it's easier to test some hypotheses about how it might be that values are shaping their risk perceptions. So what we do, we ask our subjects what they think about the risks and the benefits and weigh them of nanotechnology after dividing them into two experimental groups. One group gets only a very spare definition of what nanotechnology is. A technology for manipulating very small particles at the atomic scale that have, as a result, certain quantum properties. The other group gets that definition, but also some information on potential benefits of nanotechnology, some of the applications that scientists and others foresee, but also some of the possible risks that some people have mentioned and are worried about. And we compare the two groups, the no information group and the information group. Well, what we find is that in the no information group, there is not any meaningful, zero, essentially, variance, a disagreement among people defined with reference to their values. 61% think that the benefits outweigh the risk, but it's just noise because they don't know what it is. In the information exposed group, however, you see a very dramatic polarization of the subjects along the cultural lines that are characteristic of their environmental technology risk perceptions generally. So the hierarchical individualists, the ones who are generally risk skeptical, start to learn something about the nanotechnology. Oh, it's great, the benefits will outweigh the risks. Right? The egalitarian communitarians start to learn about, oh no, that sounds like the risks will probably outweigh the benefits. Right? Now, we also collected information on the subject's familiarity, or at least a self-reported familiarity with nanotechnology. Did this because there was evidence already from public opinion research that said, well, not many people know about nanotechnology, but the people who do, they love it. And so if you're a scientist doing research in this area, right, getting lots of grants, or you're an industry that might like to have products that involve nanotechnology, that's good news, right? The word isn't out there yet, but when it gets out there, people are going to, like it the way these people do. And that's not consistent with, well, it's not consistent with what we found, Well, we did find that among people who were in our no information group, we didn't give them any information, there was this association between having the view that the benefits of nanotechnology will outweigh the risks with familiarity with nanotechnology. Right? People who were more familiar, they thought it would be no problem. But in the information exposed group, you didn't see that. Exposing people to information didn't create a uniformly positive view of nanotechnology. created either a positive or a negative view, depending on what people's cultural outlooks were. And we found some other interesting things out about these people who know something about nanotechnology. They're not really afraid of anything. The internet, no risks there. You know, mad cow disease, no problem. Hand me a hamburger, please. Nuclear power, no problem. Genetically modified foods, private gun ownership, none of these things. They're fearless people, right? And so, of course, right away, and especially after the Japanese affair, the nuclear power industry is trying to tell everybody about nanotechnology so that they won't be afraid of nuclear power, right? I mean, obviously, that's not... Knowing something about nanotechnology does not influence whether you think mad cow disease is not a problem or nuclear power isn't the problem. This is the signature of spurious correlation. There's some third variable out there that's making people not concerned about these kinds of risks and more likely to know something about nanotechnology, right? And this is a spurious correlation. People who know something about nanotechnology are less concerned about it. That's not because of what they've learned, right? If it were, then you wouldn't see the result we did, which is that when you expose people who aren't familiar with nanotechnology to it, the information, they don't form this uniformly positive view. So there must be some third variable that explains why these people who are familiar with nanotechnology aren't worried about it. What is it? At this point, do you have any idea, given what I've... What's that? What's that? Did I make... Did the group that you gave information, did you make up some information in that? No, it was. I can show you what we gave them. Okay. There isn't. We gave them information. It wasn't even like slanted toward any particular group. Yeah.
Maybe people who are fans of technology are researching it more. So.
Yeah. Although, you know, the number of people who say they know is probably orders of magnitude more than the people who are just involved in the industry, right? But people who have some kind of pro-technology orientation, they're more likely to find out about it. Here, I'll show you, you know, the people who, the more individualistic you are, the more likely you are to know something or say you know something about nanotechnology if you're hierarchical. Right? This is the model that I was telling you about. People have cultural predispositions towards environmental risks, towards technology, towards the activities that cause the risk. Those influence their own exposure to information. People who have the individualistic and hierarchical values, they do have a pro-technology orientation. Maybe they do want to find out about these things in advance, or at least say they know about them, and of course they're going to say they like what they see because that's what their cultural predisposition is. But when you expose people to information, they react in the way that's consistent with their cultural predisposition. So the egalitarian communitarians who didn't know anything about it, they reacted negatively. The hierarchical individualists who didn't know anything about it reacted positively. Right? That's the model. Right? Now, I'll tell you about scientific consensus and how it fits into this. Okay? I mean, one possibility is that this is the world sort of innocent of scientific consensus, innocent of scientific guidance. I mean, people don't, well, they didn't know anything about nanotechnology. They just relied on their gut, right? But they can't figure out other complicated risk issues for themselves either. They have to rely on what the experts say. So if they're going out there and they're seeing that the experts are all saying this is what we believe, then that should overcome this. That would be a possibility. But that surmise imagines that scientific consensus is somehow outside of the model. You know, scientific consensus is just evidence that people are relying on to figure out what the risks are. If it's subject to the same dynamics, if people are engaged in culturally biased forms of search on what experts believe, if when they're shown information, they credit it selectively in a way that, depending on whether it supports what they already believe or what they know other people like them believe or what just strikes them emotionally as sensible given their cultural predispositions, then rather than fix the problem, scientific consensus will just be another one of the things about which you have political dissensus because of cultural cognition. But we don't just tell stories, so we're trying to collect some evidence. We do a study like this, right? And in the study, again, have a large sample of US adults, and we want to know what their perceptions of scientific consensus are on what kinds of issues. Climate change, the disposal of nuclear waste in deep geologic isolation like Yucca Mountain, whether guns make people more safe or less. Right? We focus on those issues in part because we already have information about what people's cultural predispositions are on those issues, but we focus on them also because it happens to be the case that on those questions there are National Academy of Sciences, NRC, expert consensus reports. And those can then be a kind of useful baseline for interpreting the kinds of patterns you might see in the perceptions of what scientific consensus are among people who have different values. Right? And what do we find? There you go. Our hypothesis is confirmed. You know, what we do, we don't accept that kind of crap when people give it to you, because that's persuasion by awe or intimidation or something. You can always take something like that and make the results practically meaningful. And if you can't, then this is just, you know, garbage. But here's what we're doing. It's not garbage, but you know, because it's the kind of it's. I'll tell you the patterns we see. We test to make sure that these relationships hold up. But what we're doing is we're collecting all this information on people's cultural values, their other kinds of characteristics, right? And then we're able to say who is more likely to believe. How much more likely are they to believe that most scientists have this position, most scientists reject this position, right? Or are divided on a particular issue like climate change, right? So I can tell you that on this question, what do expert scientists believe? Are global temperatures increasing? Egalitarian communitarians are 4 times more likely to believe that most scientists agree with that than hierarchical communitarians. Or if you find somebody who says, I think scientific consensus is that, 4 times more likely to be an egalitarian communitarian than a hierarchical individualist. A hierarchical individualist is 8 times more likely to think most scientists disagree that the global temperatures are increasing, 4 times more likely than the egalitarian communitarian to think that scientists are simply divided on the issue. Right? And of course we know that the National Academy of Sciences, other scientific organizations of tremendous eminence and authority and qualification say that this is the consensus position. Climate change is happening, humans are causing it, and it's going to be a problem. Right? So what's wrong with the hierarchical individualist? Right? But well, how about same thing with, by the way, with are humans causing it? 5 times more likely if you're egalitarian community to believe that. Much more likely to believe disagreement, division on whether humans are causing this if you're hierarchical individuals. Deep geologic isolation to nuclear wastes. Right? The egalitarians, communitarians, twice as likely to believe that most scientists agree that deep geologic isolation of nuclear waste is unsafe. Right? The hierarchical individuals twice as likely to believe most scientists believe that it is. Most expert scientists believe that that is a safe way to dispose of nuclear waste, and they're about the same on whether there's division. Right? Well, the National Academy of Sciences has, in multiple reports over a sustained period of time, said scientific consensus is that deep geologic isolation of nuclear waste is safe. It's safe in absolute terms. Right? It's safer than alternative ways of dealing with the waste. It's a part of a safer system for generating energy than doing things like burning fossil fuels and so forth. They've been saying that since Hans Bethe said that in the 1970s. Right? Well, here you see, at least against the background of the National Academy of Sciences report, somebody who believes the scientific consensus is that that's what a safe thing to do, twice as likely to be a hierarchical individualist. Right? Most scientists disagree, twice as likely to be egalitarian communitarian. Now, how about this one? Permitting adults without criminal records or histories of mental illness to carry concealed handguns in public decreases violent crime, right? I mean, but you hear that claim because, you know, Texas passed a law saying we're sick and tired of the shootings on campus. Everybody can carry their own gun to campus and that way protect everybody else. Well, you know what the National Academy of Sciences says? That we can't say. I mean, there are lots of reports out there. It's the econometric battle of attrition, you know, and they'll never run out of computer CPU power to keep cranking out the multivariate regression analyses. You know, more guns, less crime. More guns, more crime. Great, less filling. And the National Academy of Sciences, you know, you're just not going to get anywhere this way because the models are too fragile to specification of the variables and the relationships among them. On the basis of the evidence, you just can't say. You can't say that allowing people to carry concealed weapons in public increases crime or decreases it. Well, 5 times as many hierarchical individualists think most scientists agree that that reduces crime. 4 times as many egalitarian communitarians think that most scientists believe that it increases disagree that carrying the guns decreases crime, and they're about evenly divided. You know, so look, this is the point. You know, the groups are about equally likely to believe that scientific consensus is different from what is reflected in the National Academy of Consensus reports if that National Academy Consensus report takes a position contrary to the one that's culturally congenial to them. Now, the point isn't that the National Academy of Consensus reports are kind of like Gallup polls for scientists, right? But knowing that there's this kind of conflict, not only between the groups themselves, but between the groups and the National Academy of Sciences in a selective pattern, helps you to make sense of some possible explanations of what's going on here. One is that one of the groups is really smart and the other is really dumb. One is really plugged into what scientists think and the other is just oblivious to it, right? Well, now that you know that the groups are as likely to disagree with the National Academy of Sciences consensus position, at least believe scientists don't hold the National Academy of Science consensus position when it's contrary to their predisposition, as they are to disagree with the other. You could believe that one of them is smarter than the other only if you believed it was a more reliable guide of what scientific consensus is than the National Academy of Sciences. Right? You want to know what the scientific position is on an issue? Don't look at the National Academy of Science consensus reports. Go out and talk to the egalitarian communitarians because they're dead on all these issues. And the National Academy of Science, that's one possibility. Right? Here's another hypothesis. Neither one of them is a particularly reliable guide of what scientific consensus is. They're both conforming their views of what most scientists believe to their cultural predispositions. That's a hypothesis. I think it fits the observational data better, but that's just because sounds more plausible to me. But let's test it with an experiment. Here are some possible experts. Are these people credible experts on global warming, nuclear power, gun control? Each one of them, they're not real, right? By subjects who don't know it. Each one of them is depicted as having received elite PhD training from a major university, to be now on the faculty of one of those universities, and to be a member of the National Academy of Sciences, among other important scientific organizations in their field. And so we say to people, hey, you have a friend who wants to form a position on one of these disputed issues of climate change, nuclear power, gun control. So he's thinking of going out and buying on Amazon a big, fat book on the subject to read up on it, but doesn't want to waste his time and money if the person who wrote it doesn't know what the heck he's talking about. We say he. We just write males here so there's no confound with other factors. It could well be, right? So does he know what he's talking about, right? And the person, we show the subject then these kinds of qualifications of the person who wrote the book. So is that somebody you should listen to if you're trying to teach yourself or learn something about these issues? So we ask them, right? But we also have an experimental manipulation. We impute to either the position that the risk in question is a high risk or that it's a low risk, right? Geologic isolation nucleus, high risk or low risk. You know, concealed carry laws, increased crime, decreased crime. Half the subjects see one, half see the other, right? And what we find then is this. What we find, what we're looking for is to see whether people's evaluations of whether somebody who has a PhD from one of our major research institutions, who teaches at one of our major research science universities, who has managed to get in the National Academy of Sciences, which is not that easy to do, right, should be viewed as an expert, somebody that it's worth listening to on an issue. And we find out that the answer is yes or no, depending on whether the position that that person is depicted as taking is consistent with the predisposition, cultural predisposition of the person who's making a judgment on whether he's an expert or not, right? If he's given the high-risk position, well, then the egalitarian community says, oh, of course he's an expert. And look at the hierarchical individual. Oh, he's not an expert on climate change, not an expert on concealed carry. You know, well, it's closer on the nuclear risk. They flip around in the low-risk position. Right? These are big effect sizes. People are very influenced by what they understand the person's position to be in deciding if the person even knows what the heck he's talking about as an expert. That is a kind of confirmation bias. People have cultural predispositions on these issues, right? Probably that explains their views on scientific consensus. They're hearing this from their friends or whatever. You know, maybe they're searching out to the information on what scientific consensus is, but when they're shown information about what a scientist says on something, they're deciding, oh, that's an expert or not an expert, based on whether the person is saying something that's consistent with their cultural risk, with their cultural predisposition. Oh, yes, his hair is black. He's from Finland. You see? It's as if, you know, here's what will happen. The problem isn't half the people or some fraction of the people, listen to this, the scientists know what they're talking about. And the other half are saying, no, scientists are dumb. You know? No, everybody could think scientists are great. Everybody, you know, everybody. They're the most respected group in our society, according to polls conducted by Pew and other organizations. People who disagree about these issues on climate change and other related ones, they disagree about what experts believe. They're not disagreeing about whether you should believe experts. And he'll show you one, I'm going to give you another little quiz here. I wanted you to tell me what the significance of this is. So we go out there, we ask people, you know, how serious a risk is climate change on a scale of 0 to 10? So it doesn't really matter what number they give you. What you want to do is look to see what the sources of variance are and how serious people say the risk of climate change is. We can test some hypotheses then maybe about why people, on average, don't take climate change as seriously as scientists say that they should. One explanation is that people don't, it's a hard issue. How are they supposed to know? They're not very science literate, right? Now, you know, if that's true, well, here you just tell me, what's your prediction? As people become more science literate, measured with the kinds of evaluations that the National Academy of Sciences uses, they're indicators for science literacy, and they're used commonly in the social sciences. You know, we're so much dumber than we used to be, and look in Japan's. So as you become more science literate, do you become more concerned, less concerned? What happens? You know, predictions? It's ESP. Just like use ESP and tell me what the next slide is going to show.
Lesser risk.
That they see less risk. Why do you say it?
No change.
No change. You know, here's a prediction, I would think at least. Anybody find that startling? What's that? Oh, what's your prediction now?
I misunderstood the question.
Oh, okay, go ahead. Now do you understand it? As people become more science literate, well, do you accept this prediction? That as they become more, this is a prediction, see, it's underscore. As they become more,
I accept that prediction.
you accept it?
Yes.
Well, you should have stuck with your first answer. You know, it's like the Monty Hall problem or something. You know, never pick another door. You got a goat. I mean, you got worse than a goat. I'll tell you why. But the truth is, there's not much of an association, if any. It's negative, but it's tiny. Now, here's the cultural variance. This is what I was already telling you, right? Being an egalitarian communitarian predicts a lot of concern. Being a hierarchical individual predicts very little concern. It's obviously a bigger effect than science literacy, but the real issue is what's the relationship between them? Maybe, you know, maybe those hierarchical individuals aren't very science literate. What will happen? How about this? Do you accept this prediction that as the hierarchical individuals become more science literate, they'll become less skeptical about climate change, right? And as a result, the gap that you see between the cultural groups, it should lessen, right? It should lessen as they become more science literate. Do you want to accept? You choose another door? You know,
I choose no prediction.
No, that's fair. I mean, look, I'm not, but you know, I'm not fair. But you know, you can see. Can you see why people would choose this? Yeah, why?
Because I can see why I would choose that.
Okay, but that's all right. You know, it's okay. I even said why people might say that. Yeah, there's not many things worth investigating that have no surprising impact, you see. And so what would people expect to see here? They would expect to see, why would they expect to see this? What's the intuition? Or even the hope? Why should there's cultural polarization. Is the cultural polarization going to get bigger or smaller as people become more science literate? Are people who are less science literate more culturally polarized than people who are more science literate, or vice versa? And there is an intuitive explanation, you know, thought. Well, it's got to decrease. Why?
Well, I would think that egalitarian communitarians would feel that it was a greater risk simply because they had more, they more thought about the global community as opposed to themselves and what was happening to them in their lifetime.
Well, that's possible. I mean, here's one. There are issues of value as well as fact in here, right? We do this a lot of different ways. Like we just ask, what do you think is the truth? Is the temperature increasing? Is that because of humans, right? And those then don't have anything to do with whether you're worried about future generations. You might say, I don't care about climate change because it's those guys in the future who will bake, you know, not me or something. It turns out, though, no matter what you ask people, you know, their answers, they have a single yay or boo response, and all these answers correlate very nicely. So it's very simple to just ask them something like this rather than ask them 25 things, the answers to which will all be consistent as long as they can understand the valence of your question, right? But egalitarian communitarians, as they become more science literate, are they more concerned about the future generations? You don't want to be tricked, but this is an obvious prediction because you think if people are science literate, they rely on the science. If they don't know anything, they go on their gut. And it's filled with crap like their cultural views and so forth and so on. But you already distrust me enough to know that what you see is this. Well, the egalitarian communitarians become slightly more concerned as they become more science literate. The hierarchical individuals become less concerned as they become more science literate. The gap doesn't shrink, it grows. Right? These are not people whose skepticism is rooted. I mean, there are people who are anti-science. There are people you can find who will say that they don't believe in it because they have an anti-enlightenment view of things. But they're not driving this. Right? What's going on here? Yeah?
You only read articles that you already agree with, and so the more of those you read, the more...
How about that? What are they trying to maximize here? I mean, first of all, it doesn't have any impact on the climate, what I believe. I was hoping for a sunny day today, you know, and look at it. But does my view, if I come in here and tell you, I think it's a big hoax, everybody, you know, that will have an impact on how you feel about me. But if people you know, in New Haven, Yale and so forth, that can have an impact on me. If I live in you know, I don't know, in Minnesota or Alaska, I don't know where it is exactly. And I say, you know, well, there's no climate. We should take it seriously, everybody. You know, maybe that'll get me into... People want to form the views that help them to get along in their lives. And people who are more science literate, and we've also done this with numeracy. How good are you in processing numerical information? They're even better at being able to find evidence out there to reinforce their views, and they become even more confident and even more polarized, right? And I don't know, I might have taken up all my time, and we don't have any more time, but my point is going to be something like, you know, you tell me, at first I have to convince you that this is something at least, you know, it could be part of the problem. But if it is, you know, what's the solution? People are processing, people have a reason to interpret the information in a way that fits their cultural predispositions because the issues have that kind of significance for them, right? We can't get rid of people's cultural predispositions, right? But can we do something to eliminate what otherwise is the kind of incentive that they feel, which is one that's very normal and adaptive, that they want to be sure they're fitting in with other people, to construe the information on things like climate change in a way that guides them and guides them on other issues too, away from what the scientific consensus might be. That doesn't usually happen, by the way, or else we'd all be dead, you know. Here's an example. Vaccine, right? CDC says that should be the vaccine. You know about this, the HPV vaccine. It's not even more nanotechnology, right? So CDC says all the schoolgirls should get the vaccine before they might be exposed to the virus through sexual activity. There's tremendous political pushback. Well, next week, I mean, not literally next week, CDC says everybody get the H1N1 swine flu vaccine. Yeah, there's a controversy. Who's going to be at the front of the line? The people are trampling the old people and children who are the ones who are supposed to be getting it. You know, but they're not saying, I don't believe the CDC or something like that. Of course they believe the CDC. Normally, people fall into the number of cases where you just get the memo and do what the expert says, orders of magnitude greater than the ones on which you get the kind of dissensus that you get on something like HPV and climate change. You get it because something strange happened to that issue that made the position on it a sign of who you are, whether you're a member in good standing of your group. That doesn't have to happen, right? Maybe it's more likely to happen with certain kinds of issues. If it is, we should be trying to identify what those issues are, like synthetic biology, for example, and trying to avoid that happening with them, right? But it also can happen because of the way sometimes, even just by accident, that we convey information about what it means to hold a position in the course of just explaining what the position is. When people have to rely on others they trust to know what to make of complicated issues like this. So if you tell them they're wrong, there's a risk that they're going to understand that you're telling them that the people who are very important to them and whose respect they need are stupid or corrupt. And just in case they're not getting that message, you know, you can, well, I don't want to go through this, but you know, if you write a book like this, that you're telling them exactly that. You're raising the cost. You're communicating that the meaning cost of accepting this is high. That's not necessary, right? You can have a diversity, and I'm going to show you something on HPV, but there are a diversity of people out there who have positions on climate change. The diversity of them is a resource, right? There are other ways, too, to influence the meaning, emphasizing other kinds of solutions to problems and so forth that cohere better with people's climate, with their views. And the point isn't to, you know, to market things. And it shouldn't be, and I know I'm not going to get an argument from you. It's not to try to push people around and make them believe any particular thing. It's to try to create an environment where the likelihood that they can believe what turns out to be true because they can consider it free of the kind of social political pressure that generates that kind of distortion exists. Right? That can't be taken for granted. People construe the information out there in a climate in which the information and the acceptance of it can be information about who they are. And it's not good for them, you know, when the groups to which they belong end up polarized on these issues. It's good if everybody of all values can have a reason to find whatever the truth is acceptable and congenial to them. That's good not just because you're a good liberal or anything like this, but it is good if you're a good liberal in all of this. It's good because that's the way in which humans become smarter, by knowing whom to trust about what. And that depends on certain kinds of reliable mechanism cues of authority. Those can become ruined, distorted by this kind of political interference. Hey, it's a deliberative climate that needs environmental protection just as much as the physical environment, and providing it as a kind of public good, right? So this is a science of science communication, to create conditions in which people, likelihood of converging on the scientific truth has no connection, right, to these kinds of values. How to do that, I think, is complicated. But I do want to start by at least, you know, appealing to you to consider that that is the goal that we should have in this. Okay? So that's it.